Hiya! We're back. Welcome to Bleed Build, featuring Cat. Ain't that right, buddy? You're gonna be in my way today? Fair enough. Alright, I'm gonna try and do this all catted up. So, Bleed Build. What's it all about? Why do people play it? What is it for? Why is it new? It's not new, but what are we doing? So, here, this is a breakdown. We did an 11 Motherlode. Motherlode, fairly AoE. We did, however, die. We missed the timer by 5 seconds. Very unlucky. Because we wiped the last boss, unfortunately. So let's look at the breakdown here. You can see, right off the bat, it's a lot of Crimson Tempest, a lot of Garrotes, a lot of Rupture, a lot of Sanguine Blades. And I was running this build, which you might look at and you might compare to something like, for example, if I pull it up, my own guide. Right? Look at this build, and then look at the guide. Slightly different, right? Guide doesn't take Kingsbane. I'm taking Blindside. That's taking no Iron Wire. This is taking Iron Wire. Lots of things you can do with this build, right? A lot of things you can do with this build. And I'm here to kind of give you the ups and downs of why people are playing this early in the season, what it's good for, if it's going to continue to be viable, if it's not going to continue to be viable. All of the stuff you need to know. So first of all, let's go over the actual build itself, which, again, written extensively in the Wowhead guide. There's information here. There's also information on general talent swaps up here. All the information you need to know, what a bleed build is, what a hybrid build is, what a cleave build is. I'm going to be going over all of that. So read up on that if you haven't, if you need additional reading. But this is kind of the thing that I'm going to be basing everything off of for this kind of argument. So what is a bleed build? A bleed build is Giga Bleed. As you can see, no Kingsbane, no Dragon Tempered Blades, no Poison Bomb, no Amp Poison, no nothing. It's Arterial Precision, it's Sudden Demise, it's huge bleeds all over the place, and you can see it exactly in the breakdown. It does mostly bleed damage, and Envenom is pretty low. Kingsbane's pretty low as well, right? Compared to a normal build, the Envenom damage is a lot lower, the Caustic Spatter damage is a lot lower. The overall, however, slightly higher, and the single target is slightly lower. So you get more AoE, get less single target, right? So let's compare some numbers here. First of all, why? Why is this now being played a little more? Well, going into the patch, we got a 6% Rupture buff. We then also got a 6% Crimson Tempest buff, and a buff on Sudden Demise for extra bleed damage, and Arterial Precision hits more targets, right? So that's more Rupture, more Crimson Tempest, which again is more Sanguine Blades, more Sudden Demise, which is more bleed damage, which again buffs all of these things, and Arterial Precision, it's 8 targets now. 7 additional targets. That's more bleed damage to more targets in more AoE. So that is just generally better, right? More AoE, more bleed, more better. So it got a pretty big buff. This build specifically got a pretty big buff. So let's compare some numbers specifically. First of all, hybrid build, still better, right? However, you'll see taking Iron Wire, you need to drop Bone Spike, Doomblade, and you pick up Twist the Knife and Iron Wire for this, and it's about a 4% loss. You can drop Kingsbane even, and it's a 4% loss. Some of these are weird, but you're looking at like a 4, 5, almost 6% loss in some cases to take Iron Wire. Not great, right? This was a change after the Twist the Knife rework. Before taking Iron Wire wasn't too big of a loss, but then they reworked Twist the Knife, and now it's pretty bad, pretty big loss, pretty big loss. So 4 or 5%, but if you compare that to a bleed build, right? Bleed build, this has Kingsbane and some weird stuff, but the guide build, for example, is this. No. This This is the guide build, right? So if we just compare to the guide build, Ironwire is less than 1%. It's 0.5% compared to the guide build, right? You can also drop stuff like, there's a Kingsbane drop in here somewhere, but you get the point, right? Like there's Ironwire drops here that are a lot less punishing, generally. And you can drop stuff like the same stuff. So you could drop, you know, Bone Spike, for example. I think that's what the top one... No, the top one drops some other nonsense. It goes like this. Takes Kingsbane. This is basically the build I was playing here. But it goes like this instead of this. Right? Very similar. So dropping Bone Spike for that, very reasonable. There's some other swaps in here, but it's a much less loss, right? It's a lower loss. And so even though this build is about 5% behind, you can see the damage difference here. In Dungeon Slice, mind you, Dungeon Slice is a very single target heavy sim. It still has AoE, but it also has a boss at the start. So keep that in mind when comparing. It is behind in Dungeon Slice, but if you're taking Ironwire, this is a much lower loss compared to this, right? You see Ironwire here is 3.3, and so we're already closer to 3.2, 3.3, much closer. So the question then becomes, how much of a loss is it in AoE? How much loss is it in single target? Why do people play it? So this is the hybrid build with Dragon Timber Blades in single target. This is a 5-minute fight, so it's a longer fight. It just has Lust, right? No raid buffs. So this is single target, 5 minutes, long dungeon boss, 1.5 mil. Not good, not great. Our single target in general, really bad. And then we can look at the bleed build. 1.47. Not that much worse if you're looking at it, right? Not that much worse. It's 60k less. Is that a lot? Kind of. But in general, right, this is not looking that rough. And you'll see that the damage breakdown is also quite different, which has some niche things going on that we can look at. But let's just take a quick look at the AoE comparison, and then we'll circle back around. So AoE comparison. Again, this is a 40-second 8-target boss. Or 8 boss targets. So this is 8-target AoE. It's 40 seconds, no bloodlust, right? So this is a shorter pull. You'll see with the hybrid build, big number, right? But it's a lot of caustic spatter. It's a lot of envenom. And then we can just flip over. Similar number. Now be aware this is a little hand wavy, little inaccurate. We don't really do AoE sims. We don't optimize for it. So these numbers, just focus on the damage breakdown more than anything. But you see the damage breakdown, caustic spatter much lower, and venom much lower, right? Shiv is higher because we're taking the Shiv talents. And so look at how much this drops. So caustic spatter 19.4, 24.5, right? That's a 5% drop on caustic spatter. In venom, 4%, 9.8%. This obviously includes poison bomb, right? But that is a 6% drop in envenom. So altogether, 6% drop in envenom, 5% drop in caustic spatter, and that's all going back into the bleed damage. So in what situations could this be helpful, right? Just the AoE, if you think about it in your head, caustic spatter and envenom, one, requires that you have a target for the entire duration, right? You need to ramp up on a target, you need to deal damage to that target, you need your cooldowns to go through that target, right? Caustic spatter requires that you have a thing to hit that everything will splash off of. Sometimes, especially in low keys like we're doing week 1, week 2, that's not possible. They just die, right? The other thing is you actually get some of the single target damage in like an AoE pull like this back using a bleed build. Especially if you're able to cleave and stuff isn't dying as quickly, right? You can get the same amount of damage off through singular focus. I know here it's a little similar, right? Because all the targets are living for the same duration. But if you think about a situation where you're pressing cooldowns onto one target and it dies in like 15 seconds, right? it could die in 20 by just getting the damage more spread out, right? You're not funneling it all in on one target, you're spreading it out. And so the pack as a whole is getting the bleed damage versus just focusing on one target, having that target die, and then now you need to swap to the next target, right? That's good in some situations. I'm not saying there isn't a situation for that, but in general, in low keys, if you can spread it out a little bit more, it's typically beneficial. In higher keys, obviously, higher keys with big fortified numbers where mobs have a ton of health, you might see the hybrid build come back, because that's more single target. That's more focused on dealing damage to that one target. And you'll see that here as well. But the main reason why people played hybrid is for the single target gain, right? The boss damage. It's all about the boss damage. How do we make bosses faster? Because Assassination as a spec, terrible boss damage in Mythic Plus. It's really not that great. And so people have played hybrid to try and get some of that boss damage back. But this isn't that much of a difference, right? And so why is this changed? Where does this come from? Well, with the Crimson Tempest buffs and the new set bonus, what ends up happening is Crimson Tempest is actually better. Now, this is already better even without the new set bonus. It's better at 2+2. It's better at the new 4-piece. This is always better. But Crimson Tempest in single target is actually doing quite a bit of work here. You can see 8.5% damage just from Crimson Tempest, right? 16% from Envenom, and then you have a lot of Rupture, a lot of Garrote, Melees, Deathmark, Crimson Tempest, right? Compare that. Most of your damage here in Venom, all in Venom. Kingsbane, Garrote, Rupture, right? No Crimson Tempest because it's not worth casting. But what does this mean, right? This means that in cleave situations, right, where you have bosses with multiple targets, you can get arterial precision on those adds. You can cleave those adds better, right? You have Zoldyck. So as the fight goes on longer, in execute phases, right, you're able to get even more damage out. Especially when the fight gets tough at the ends, right? Sometimes at the end of fights, bosses can be pretty tough. Zoldyck actually helps quite a bit with that. Your execute damage is pretty high, especially when bosses start lasting longer than 2 minutes, right? On like some of the longer, higher keys, bosses last over 2 minutes. If you get a second set of cooldowns off inside of execute, that helps tremendously, right? Remember that this is a 5-minute fight, so this is getting 1 set of cooldowns off in execute and 2 without execute. So that last set, we can actually compare here. That last set here, pretty high, right? This is a pretty high base. And then if you go over to this comparison, you see not only is the burst lower, but the general damage here is also lower, right? So in situations where there's longer boss fights, you get a second set of cooldowns off. That execute might also help, just as a timing thing, right? So then we run into the problem of, well, if it's good, why aren't people playing it? And the thing is, people were playing it in very specific situations. Some people were calling this a Chinese build last season because there was some Chinese logs that popped up that were playing a bleed build, a very similar bleed build in Grim Batal specifically. Grim Batal has a lot of AoE. Iron Wire was good in Grim Batal. So you saw a lot of people playing more of a bleed-focused setup versus a hybrid. And that was kind of swarming around. There were some other people that played it in like 15s, 16s. It's been viable for a while, and it's been in the guide as well for a while. But because of this back and forth of, oh, need more boss damage, need more, need more burst on the Kingsbane, need that Kingsbane to be bigger, people have been playing hybrid more. But again, start of the season, bleed build, more bleed damage, more sudden demise, right? So you have this perfect storm of, it's a new season with low keys, mobs that die quickly, so you can get more sudden demise damage. You have buffs to Rupture, Crimson Tempest, Arterial Precision, Sudden Demise, all buffing bleed builds, right? It was already viable in pretty heavy AoE keys. Then you have the fact that the boss damage isn't all that different, and there's the optimization of Crimson Tempest and single target. It's all coming together, right? All the pieces are kind of fitting together to where this isn't that big of difference, and this also isn't that big of difference. Now, mind you, in this 11 that we ran, this 11 Motherlode, my sudden demise did 4%. In some 10s and a couple, like, even in 9s where it's, like, much lower, there's no fortified, my sudden demise sometimes is doing, like, 8-9% of my damage. This is raw execute damage that you do not see in Sims. Sims do not evaluate it, right? There's no damage line here for sudden demise. Even though this is 8 targets, 40 seconds, there's no damage here from sudden demise. Because sudden demise in Sims is purely the bleed damage increased by 15%, not the execute part. So if you're buffing the execute part, that's technically just free damage. Some people call it pad, right? But it's Sims without the pad. And the numbers here are very similar. Additionally, in Hectic AoE, right, we saw the difference here. In Hectic AoE, 5% less caustic spatter, and then 5%, 6% less envenom damage. You're dealing more of your damage with stuff that you don't need to technically be hitting the mob for. So there is that kind of ethereal, oh, it's better with downtime arguments that people can make. Because so much of your damage isn't in envenom anymore, right? If I need to move for a swirl, well, I can move for a swirl. All my dots are ticking. If I miss an envenom, that's okay, right? It's less of a loss if I miss an envenom or two. It's less of a loss if I'm not stacking my amp poison on this target constantly, right? All of that kind of factors in. So, is it the better build? No, probably not. As keys start getting higher, as bosses start getting more difficult, as the timers for bosses start to become more of an issue, probably not the best. Probably not the best. Not going to see it anymore. People will try to min-max more single target with Assassination because it is so bad and it does make Assassination pretty non-viable in high keys. But for now, bleed build is pretty good, right? Especially in the lower keys, especially when you're farming 7s and stuff for your hero track gear, right? Like if you're farming priories over and over and over to get your signet, to get your trinket, if you're farming Floodgate on a 7 to get your Sephorium Pacemaker over and over and over on a hero track, and you don't care about, you know, bosses taking a minute 30 instead of a minute 20, in that case, bleed build really good. Sudden demise cranks really hard. I've had overalls above 3.5 million in some of these low keys. In like a 5, I was doing almost 3.8 million DPS. A lot of that obviously is sudden demise padding, but the key goes quick. You're doing a lot of overall damage, and the sudden demise pops are really, really nice. So, with all of that out of the way, all the numbers, all of the discussion, I'll leave it up to you to make the distinction of which build you want to play. Everything is still viable. So, as we saw, you can make your decision. Do you go a little bit more into the caustic spatter and venom side, or do you go more into the bleed side of things? Whichever you prefer. I personally love bleeds. I love the bleed build, so that's kind of what I've been doing lately. It's been working fine for me. And I can even show you some of the bosses. Last boss here, 1.1, not great. Then we had this boss. The monk obviously going crazy. Monk single target is really good. We had this boss with the 2 shards that spawn. This was going pretty well. I had a lot of Crimson Tempest and Caustic Spatter damage on this. Then you had the coin-operated pummeler. This is the one where you kick the footballs into the boss and it takes increased damage. So I was keeping up with Ret Paladin here. I was obviously behind Monk. Monk does a ton of boss damage. But like, this isn't the most unrespectable thing, right? You have to consider the only real single target talent I'm taking is Blindside. Like, realistically, if you look, Kingsbane's doing like 8% of my damage, right? But Kingsbane's also a bit of an AoE button for Caustic. And so I'm taking, I guess, Kingsbane and Blindside, and the rest of this is AoE. I'm taking Lightweight Shiv for Arterial. I'm taking Double Vanish. I'm taking nothing but bleed talents here. I'm taking crit on opener for more damage on my opener. Like, it's basically just full AoE talents, and I'm kind of keeping up. It's obviously not great. That's not the point of this build. The point of this build is doing big, heavy AoE. Let's look at that AoE. The trash between the two last bosses, right? That like little gauntlet with the mines, pretty large. The trash before that, with all the masterminds, right? After you ride the cart, the masterminds, the testers, the alchemists, pretty high. Trash before Azeroth, right? Between the crowd pummeler, that's with all the miners and stuff like that. A little bit lower. I also died. This was also a bit of a scuffed kind of run, a little bit in that regard. And then the first trash also died here. We had a wipe, I think, in this part because we pulled too heavy. But even then, lots of AoE, right? Lots and lots and lots of AoE. So that's what the build's good for. Now, main question. T, how do you use it? It's still just macroed. Macroed with Shiv, works fine. Then you have an additional Vanish charge. How do you use that? I'm mainly using it for Ironwire, I'm going to be honest. It's either big AoE or Ironwire. Ironwire has been really, really good in saving a lot of pulls and a lot of double pulls, a lot of body pulls. But in hierarchies, you probably use it to chain. So if a tank is chaining, you will want to use Vanish to get that. You'll also want to Vanish just for general damage and really long pulls, really long, heavy fortified pulls. You can Vanish for bleeds, more uptime on your improved growth, more bleed spreading. Otherwise, in single target, right, you're just using it to get your improved growth up. You have 12 seconds of Master Assassin, so you can Vanish quickly after your Kingsbane to get your Master Assassin up, to get your improved growth up. That's pretty good. And then the main thing that might be weird to people, Arterial Precision. Now, because this strikes targets in AoE and buffs bleeds, you will want to be shivving in AoE. This is also something you could be doing with the hybrid build. But in general, you can send shivs whenever you want in AoE. I'm no poisons here, but just as an example, right? Like, let's say I'm just doing an opener. It's a really big AoE pull. I get my Crimson Tempest up. I can shiv here, right? And then, obviously, mutilate, caustic spatter. The rotation here is the same. But for, like, really big stuff, bang, another shiv. And you're cranking. So no poisons, no caustic spatter here, right? 5 targets, no caustic spatter. I'm doing 4 million on an opener. Pretty good stuff. So Shiv, good. Use Shiv in AoE for the bleed damage. And then the last thing, Crimson Tempest in single target. It takes priority over your Envenom unless you're in cooldowns. So it's a little bit cringe, but without amplifying poison, giving you 35% extra damage on all of your Envenoms, you will definitely want to Crimson Tempest in single target. This is a pretty significant gain. It's about 1.5% for this build specifically. Except when you're in cooldowns, obviously. When you press your cooldowns, you want the Envenom uptime. And then once you have Envenom up, right, if you have energy to spend, you can go back into Crimson Tempest. You just want to maintain this buff so that you get your poisons going. Kingsbane ramping. Single target shivs, still the same thing, right? You can still do the dry shiv if you want. It's less good in M+, especially without the amp poison, right? But you can still do the dry shiv. That is a shiv in Lingering Darkness with Darkest Night up. Right, 7 combo point Envenom in Lingering Darkness in Darkest Night, can still do that. But in general, right, really good build, really fun. Lots of spreading iron wires, lots and lots of it. So talent swaps, again, you can do something like this, and then take Bone Spike instead of Iron Wire. If you have, for example, a Prot Paladin, you do that. My cat is going absolutely insane for no reason. If you want Iron Wire, there's a couple of swaps you can do. You can swap Master Assassin for Iron Wire, first of all. That is a possible swap. Master Assassin is pretty good, though, especially in those lower keys that we were talking about. So, in general, I recommend taking King and then swapping Doomblade into Ironwire. This is something that I recommend doing. You can also trade Tiny Toxic Blade for Blindside. Blindside is a talent that feels much better than it actually is numerically. But especially in that execute range, it'll definitely help feel a little bit snappier. Tiny Toxic Blade, this actually makes Shiv hit pretty hard in AoE. In 8 target pulls and stuff, you'll see Shivs that you cast deal 8-9 million damage overall. So Tiny Toxic Blade, Lightweight Shiv, Arterial Precision, definitely a potent combo, but this is kind of the point that you want to flip-flop back and forth as you wish. You could also take Bone Spike and then move the point over. Well, can't really do that here. You would move the point over between these two, so you could take Ironwire instead of Lightweight Shiv. I personally think that playing with the extra charge is kind of valuable. It helps your burst a lot in really big pulls when you have a big pull coming up and you have 2 Shiv charges. Also, the really short cooldown on Shiv means that you can bank charges a lot easier, right? So you're more likely to be on 2 charges of Shiv than you are on 2 charges of Vanish because of the 2-minute cooldown. I think Lightweight Shiv is actually pretty good, just as a charge. And that's about it. We can look at some Sims, however, because Sims have more ideas than I do that I am not brave enough to try. So the first thing is it wants to drop Bone Spike, Doomblade, Lightweight Shiv. It wants to go Amp Poison. Now, this would kind of, again, pull it back into hybrid territory. So you wouldn't Crimson Tempest in single target, and you would get the Amplifying Poison benefit for your Envenoms for Caustic Spatter. I don't really see the point in this, however, because the whole idea of a bleed build is that you don't have Amplifying, don't deal Envenom damage, and you're dealing more damage with your bleeds and less with your Envenoms, so you can focus more on your bleeds, you can focus less on your Envenoms, you don't have that pressure to constantly be stacking your Amp Poison, to constantly be ramping your Kingsbanes. So this just kind of feels not in the nature of the build. It feels kind of antithetical to the build. So I don't really agree with this, even though it's probably good damage-wise. The same thing here. Dungeon Slice doesn't have a lot of big 8-target pulls, so the buff to Arterial Precision isn't reflected as well. And so it wants to actually take this full Twist the Knife Amp Poison combo, and it's just one of these weird, Dungeon Slice kind of mirages that it sees. Just like an AI chatbot can hallucinate a little bit, Dungeon Slice can also hallucinate, because it's such a structured kind of 2-minute boss fight and then small AoE, big AoE, small AoE, big AoE. So stuff like this kind of pops up as weird oddities and weird hallucinations that the sim can get. Again, I don't understand this as a human. It's probably fine, right? All of these talent swaps are fine. These are all good talents, but it just doesn't feel. It doesn't feel like it makes sense for the whole idea of the build. I can't really recommend that either. Obviously here, this is the same thing. You would just take Amp Poison out. You would take Doomblade and Serrated Bone Spike instead. All of these things kind of make sense, right? This again also makes sense. This is the build that's in the guide. So you can kind of sim yourself, try and make sense of it, but recognize that there was a lot of talents. We've gone over most of the swaps, right? Improved Poisons is bad. You can't swap into that because it's not good in any build. This is obviously also really bad. We don't even take this as a target, so these two talents are off the table for the build. And the rest of the talents we know that we're swapping. Dashing Scoundrel is an interesting idea, but you can't really get the points for it from anywhere. You could technically swap Kingsbane into Dashing Scoundrel, but that is, again, going in the wrong direction. So this would help with your single target energy a little bit, but you really want Twist the Knife and Dashing Scoundrel. And when you have Dashing Scoundrel and Twist the Knife, you kind of then also want Dragon Tempered Blades because it just doubles Dashing Scoundrel because there's more poisons. So, like, the idea is there and it could work. It could be an improvement, but it's just not good enough, right? Like, the entire idea of the build and why we have build archetypes is we have Bleed, to be AoE, to be not Envenom, to be not Caustic Spatter. We have Hybrid to be somewhere in the middle, and then we have Cleave, which I can show off real quick. We have Cleave, which is this left side monster, which doesn't take Sudden Demise, doesn't take Scent of Blood. This is kind of not viable ever, in my opinion, because the AoE just craters, and the single target gain is not there. The single target gain obviously is higher than it would be with either of the other builds, but the AoE is just so bad without Scent of Blood, without Sudden Demise. But, like, we have these archetypes because they each fulfill their own role. This is Giga single target, but no AoE. This is Giga AoE, but no single target. Right? And then you have Hybrid, which is the classic, like, mix of both that people play and people love. People played all through Season 1. I think Bleed and Hybrid are both viable for their own reasons. But when you see sims like this that, you know, try to mix the two ideas and smash them together, as a human, that doesn't really make sense anymore. So, be aware of the pitfalls, right? There's also goofy shit like this, where it's like, what? What are we doing? Right? We're just dropping Sudden Demise for Kingsbane, I guess, and this is apparently like 1% worse. But Kingsbane overall in my key wasn't really doing that much, right? It was like 3% here, and then maybe another like 2% worth of Caustic if you want to round up. So many options, a lot of things you can play. Experiment with it if you like. But in general, I think this is kind of the way to go. Maybe this. Again, maybe this for like full damage if you're leaning into it. Or go something like this. But yeah. A lot of things to do. Rotational stuff to do. None of the stats or anything change. None of the embellishments change. None of that changes. It's just simply a talent swap that we can play for more or less single target. Obviously, Momentum of Despair helps with this a lot. You might see some people play Follow the Blood. Just as a side note, Follow the Blood is a weird one because it sucks. Like, objectively, this is just really bad. Compared to Momentum of Despair, because you don't get the crit rate. So, don't play this, except there's a little bit of cheese you can do in very low keys, because Follow the Blood will snapshot onto Sudden Demise. So, like, your Crimson Tempest, if like you have Follow the Blood, you Crimson Tempest. The Crimson Tempest does 30% more damage. That counts for Sudden Demise, whereas this, I don't believe, does. So there is that little bit of cheese where, like, in super low keys, if you're only playing for the execute damage and you want the big demise for some reason, you would play Follow the Blood. Like, could, but it's not viable in keys. It's just simply a cheese, right, for more demise damage. But yeah. Hopefully that clears everything up and why you are seeing weird things and why you're seeing this new Bleed build pop up. And I know this was a lot of yap, but hopefully you found it informational. Have a good one. Bye! Let me know if you have questions.